Hello, friends. This is Darren Hayes of Pigskin.com. Before we take you to your favorite Sports History Network show, just want to tell you a little bit about some merch that you can pick up that represents your favorite SHN podcasts. So far, there's t-shirts, coffee mugs, and even books from some of the authors that do podcasts right here on SHN. Who could buy something better than that than have the history right from the gentleman that you hear talking about it? But we also are adding things each and every day. And where's that store, may you ask? Well, it's at sportshistorynetwork.com. Up at the top, there is the SHN merch button. Click on that. It'll take you right to the store, and you can be representing your favorite podcast and show the world that, hey, on the swag that I'm using, it's the headquarters of sports yesteryear, Sports History Network, and my favorite podcaster, the Sports History Network store. Shop there today. It's time for another football archaeological discovery as we have Timothy P. Brown of footballarchaeology.com visit us to tell us all about a little award called the President's Cup and its meaning in history. And Tim's got the story coming up in just a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history on a day-to-day basis. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time. So as we come out of the tunnel of the Sports History Network, let's take the field and go no huddle through the portal of positive gridiron history with PigskinDispatch.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes, Pigskindispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal to positive football history. And once again, we have a visit from our friend Timothy P. Brown of footballarchaeology.com. And he's got another subject from one of his tidbits that he wrote recently that's going to talk about something that's you'll find rather interesting, as I did when I read it. Tim, welcome back to the Pig Pen.
Darren, glad to be back. Look forward to chatting again and enjoying the winter weather as we talk football.
Your tidbit's extremely interesting. And this one tonight you had titled Battling for the President's Cup. And it was just recently on January 26th. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about and tell us what the President's Cup was.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's one of those things that was, that is now kind of forgotten, right? Most people have never heard of the President's Cup, but it was kind of a big deal in the state. And so, but like most things, there's kind of a background in order to talk about the real subject, right? And so, I think the main point, and my first book was about football played by military teams during World War I. So, I've always kind of followed football played in military settings, and I think it's one of those things that is really underappreciated in terms of the development of football as a game. And so the military, just by nature of their mission, they took the game overseas before anybody else did. So as an example, the first game played in Europe was played by two battleships that were part of the Great White Fleet. And they played in Nice, France in 1909, yada, yada. And so, the military, if you think about it, who's in the military? Well, a lot of times it's a bunch of young men who are physically fit, physically able, and a lot of them need to blow off steam. And one of the ways that they have traditionally done that is through athletics. Navy was always big on boxing because you could do that on a ship at sea, but they were also big on playing football. And so sports was both a recreation and a way to maintain fitness in the military, kind of as far back as people played sports for recreation. And then it really got a push in World War One. All the training camps during World War I, there was a lot of all kinds of sports being played. The YMCA was played a big role both in camps in the States and over in Europe. And one of the things that YMCA did was provide athletic equipment, and they set up basketball courts and football fields, etc. So athletics was a big thing. And so one of the things that kind of came out of the World War One experience was that there were, it was really the first time, other than a couple of the pro leagues in Ohio or Pennsylvania, it was really the first time where there were all-star teams put together of men who had graduated from college in the past 5-6 years, who were all in the service together at one camp or another. And these camps had 50,000 people, they had 26,000 people. I mean, these were massive, massive groups of young men. And the biggest college in the country at the time was Penn, which had 7,500 students. So all of a sudden, you had lots and lots of young men playing football. They formed these camp teams, and they were very successful. They got lots of news coverage. Lots of people attended their games. They played colleges. They beat the college. The better teams beat the colleges. So they were playing as good a football as there was in the country, during World War II or World War I. Sorry. So, but even, so then once the war ends, basically guys all, they go back to civilian life, but there remained a core of people playing or remaining in the military, and then they continued playing football. And one of the things that they did was, the Navy had done this back, till from 1905 on, but they would have these tournaments where all the destroyers or all the battleships or all the cruisers who were stationed at a particular port would have a tournament for football teams, and they determine who was the champion, and then the Norfolk would play the champion of New York and Philadelphia or whatever. In the end, they ended up forming these teams where it was like, okay, we're going to get the best Navy team and the best Army team or the best Marine team, and we're going to see, they're going to play one another and see who's best. So from like 1920 on the East Coast, they played a game like that. And kind of year after year, it was Quantico Marines that won because they just they emphasized it enough, and they had some really talented players. But in 1925, Calvin Coolidge decided to present the President's Cup to the winner of the active duty football tournament on the East Coast, right? So it was just, it was one of those things where the president and the cabinet, multiple cabinet secretaries, the general staff, the admiralty, those people would be at the games. Their wives would be at the games. They would, and it became a big social event in Washington, D.C. or Baltimore. They played it in a couple different locations. They have these military balls after the games. And it kind of, it never got to the same level as the Army-Navy Academy games, but it probably wasn't too far behind that in terms of the stature, because it was like, yeah, he's college kids, but these are the active duty guys, right? These are the real soldiers and sailors. So it was kind of a neat thing where these guys ended up playing. And, but unfortunately, shortly after the Coolidge presented this cup, and the Army decided to kind of de-emphasize these all-star teams, and then the Navy did too, and so then the Marines were left to play the Coast Guard and da-da-da. And eventually it all moved. The East Coast kind of fell apart, and the emphasis on these military all-star teams moved to the West Coast, where what's now Pendleton in San Diego, and versus the West Coast Fleet and the Army Corps that handled the Western Army Corps. But so it's just one of these things that's kind of lost in time. Nobody knows about this stuff anymore, but it was a big deal. It was in all the newspapers, and another I think really kind of fun fact is just that of the I think it was 1921 and 26 teams were coached by this guy who had played at West Point, and then he coached St. Mary's College in Texas. And his name was Dwight Eisenhower, right? So here's a guy who, became president. He led the led the Allied effort in Europe in World War II, and he then becomes president. But he was coaching one of these teams, back in the 20s, and he at one point he was stationed in Panama, and the guy who was the head coach, who has a whole separate story that I've written about, just incredible stories that guy had. But anyways, he requested, hey, bring Ike back here because I need him to help coach my team. So he transferred Ike from Panama back to the States so that he could help coach this all-star football team. It's just like crazy things that happen to guys because of football. So anyway, it's one of these things that I think people know very little about anymore about this President's Cup. On the West Coast, they played what they call the Armistice game or Armistice Day game. And they tried to apply the President's Cup there. And it didn't work out, and they just kept on playing the Armistice Day game. But so anyways, in both locations, it was a big event, big social event, military balls, big newspaper coverage, and very good football, right? I mean, a lot of these guys, initially there were a lot of guys who played at West Point or Army, and then they made it only for enlisted men. So, but still, a lot of good athletes, just a lot of young men at these bases. And, they had their pick of 10, 20, 30,000 young men, who could play football. And so they put together some pretty good teams.
Well, maybe I asked you this when we were talking about the Rose Bowl games. We were talking about those military teams from that era, from World War I. But did those camp teams, did they ever play the main Army team or the main, the Naval Academy team or West Point team?
So yes, but so in 1918, Great Lakes played they played the Naval Academy. They had come out east, so they had played 4 or 5 Big Ten teams and either tied or beaten them. And then they went out east and they played Rutgers, who had Paul Robeson at the time, and they just cleaned their clocks. They won whatever it was, 43-6 or something. They just blew Rutgers away. And the next week they go to Annapolis, and Annapolis was winning 6-0 late in the fourth quarter with the ball on the 1.5 yard line. And a guy named Ingram, who became famous as coach later on, he was, I believe, his quarterback, maybe his fullback. But anyways, he fumbles the ball, pops in the air into the hands of a Great Lakes player, who grabs the ball, runs 100 yards. Well, he tries to run 100 yards the other direction, and one of the Naval Academy players comes off the bench and tackles him. And so then, all hell breaks loose, right? And so anyways, the Academy superintendent comes out on the field and says, you're giving orders to referees, because the rules didn't clarify what the situation should be here or the conditions. And the Academy superintendent says, you are giving that touchdown to Great Lakes. Our guy cheated. That was it, right? The referee said, okay, fine. They did. And so then Great Lakes won the game, and in the locker room afterwards, they get the invitation to the 1919 Rose Bowl. So Army and Navy played some of the camp teams, but it was pretty limited, and so I for sure I know about the Great Lakes game. I'm not, I'd have to look at their records, for 17 and 18 to check on that, but I think that may have been the only game like that.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if they would or not, because it's basically what the the academies are going to be officers, and they're playing the regulars that are the guys that are going to be the grunts, playing them. So I didn't know if maybe they didn't want to cross those streams or not, but interesting.
Yeah. So, well, during World War I, the different camps applied different rules. Most of them allowed both officers and enlisted men to play on the same teams. That was kind of unusual.
Oh, okay.
The Navy and Marines were especially that way, but the Army was a little bit more, keep them separated. But but anyway, so 1918 they had the Spanish flu, and so a lot of what went on that season was play any opponent you could find, because things got so screwed up with Spanish flu, and the SATC upended most of the schedule. So it was kind of a bizarre. It was probably the most bizarre season, even worse than the COVID season that we all went through recently.
Wow, that was pretty bad.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of just strange schedules and craziness, 1918 was worse. So,
well, Tim, as always, that's great stuff. Now, why don't you tell everybody how they can get a hold and read your tidbits that you come out with every day?
Yeah, so the site is footballarchaeology.com, and the two ways to get access to it, if you're interested in looking at it daily, one is just to subscribe. You can bookmark it obviously if you want, but if you subscribe, you'll get an email sent to you with the article contents every night at 7:00 Eastern. Or you can follow me on Twitter, and again, I'm Football Archaeology there as well. So either way, my preference is that you subscribe on the site, because then make sure that you get them whether you read it or not. At least I know you've received it.
That's right. All right. Well, great stuff as always. And Tim, we really appreciate you. And folks, make sure you give a visit to footballarchaeology.com and do as Tim suggests, subscribe, get that daily tidbits. It's a great read each and every day, and you stay in football all year long. And it's a really, really excellent way to do that. So Tim, thanks a lot for joining us and sharing that story. And we'll talk to you again next week.
Hey, Darren, look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. Thanks.
That's all the football history we have today, folks. Join us back tomorrow for more of your football history. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Jean Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you gotta do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you gotta do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.